Let's talk about Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads. The opening paragraph gives us a little hint about what the argument, the theme is of his particular piece here. And it's a bit obscure, so I'm going to try to unpack this for you a little bit. This is not the beginning of it, but it's the beginning of our excerpt. He says this: "It is supposed that by the act of writing in verse, that is to say in poetry, an author makes a formal engagement, that is to say a promise, that he will gratify certain known habits of association." What he's talking about here is these habits of association are the literary expectations of the genre of poetry. That habits meaning conventional ways of doing things, and that any poet, as he or she begins to write, is stepping into a kind of contract with the reader that they will gratify, which means to meet the expectations of certain known habits of expectation. So that when I write a poem, you as the reader are expecting me to do certain things, and because this is pre-20th century, there would be expectations of rhyme and meter and other conventions of poetry. And he says that others will be carefully excluded, that there are certain elements of poetry that we keep, but there are certain other things that we do not do in poetry. So he's defining what is in scope and out of scope for the poet. And of course, one of the things he says here is metrical language, and that we have had different expectations in different eras. And he goes back to the ancient Romans and so on. So the idea here is that Wordsworth is actually anticipating that there is going to be some kind of resistance to his lyrical ballads. This is a prose introduction to a series of poems that he's written. And the purpose of the preface is to anticipate the reader's objection, because he has calculated quite rightly that readers some readers are going to be offended or upset by the fact that his poetry does not meet the conventions of the genre. One more thing I want to emphasize. When I talked about genre, one of the things that I said very clearly was that the purpose that most authors do when they engage a particular genre is they have to, number one, embrace the conventions of the genre that they're writing in. So if it's a novel, it has to look like a novel. What does that mean? It has to have characters, it has to have plot, it has to kind of look like the other novels that have preceded it. On the other hand, if a new novel looks exactly like everything that's come before it, there is no innovation. And so on the other side of that coin, every author has to respect the laws of the genre that they inherit, but they also need to innovate and to change and to modify the genre in order to move it forward. And this preface for Coleridge is basically alerting the reader to the fact that there's going to be stuff in here, guys, that you're not going to like, that's going to surprise you. So he says, the principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life. And this is absolutely critical, because so much of the literature before did not describe common life, but described ideal life. And so what Wordsworth wants to do is to escape, and this is one of the parts of his romanticism, to escape from the biases of civilization and upper class society and all of the expectations that go with that. And to take common life and to describe or relate them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language really used by men. So what he's trying to do is write poetry in the language that ordinary rural speakers would use. Now here's the problem. Poetic language is supposed to be artificial in the sense that it is carefully crafted and not the way that we usually talk. But he wants to base his poetry on ordinary language, not the sort of compressed, articulate, figurative language that is normally associated by poetry. Ordinary men in the country and women, farmers, dairy farmers, whatever, laborers, don't speak in rhyme and don't speak in meter and don't speak in poetic language. So he's trying to impose two different things, one on top of the other, that don't really fit. He wants to have the real language of common life done in poetry. And on top of that, he admits that he's going to have to add what he calls a coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. So it's not realism in the sense that he's trying to mimic what is actually said and how it's said among common laborers in the country. He's using that as a base, but then he wants to improve it with his imagination. And this is a very humanist and Renaissance notion, if you think about it, because when I talked about humanism, remember me talking about gardening and landscaping and how the Renaissance mind wants to perfect what is in nature. So that impulse, that romantic impulse to go back into the countryside, to leave the city, to look at ordinary people for inspiration, is kind of offset by his desire to elevate that to a level of poetry. Why does he like the country and country folk? Because, he says, the essential passions of the heart find better soil in which they can attain their maturity. Now, this is a metaphor. He's likening the passions of the heart to a seed that is planted in fertile soil and will grow into a full plant. And the argument is that human beings outside of civilization, in the natural world of the countryside, are more likely to return to the essential passions of the heart. I remind you of my brief discussion in Romanticism on Rousseau's notion of the noble savage, namely that people who live outside and apart from the city, civilization meaning the city, are somehow closer to nature and therefore somehow closer to Eden and to God and to the purity of human life as it was intended. He also says they are under less restraint from civilization. They speak a plainer and more emphatic language because everything is elemental, fundamental, down to basics, and not sophisticated. He talks here about the simplicity of country life as opposed, by implication, to the complexity of city life. And therefore, the manners of rural life germinate from these elementary feelings. We're going back to basics. And the condition, the passions of men are incorporated into the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. So he says the language, too, of these men has been adopted, not copied, not mirrored. Remember that Sidney, when he talks about poetry, talks about mimesis, which is adopting language and adopting nature. But Sidney also says, if you recall, that the job of the poet is to transcend nature and to improve upon nature and to create new things. And so Wordsworth is actually, in his romantic, the spirit of Romanticism is hearkening back to this Renaissance humanism, purified from what appear to be its real defects, and from all lasting and rational causes of dislike or disgust. So if you think about it, if you know cowboys or farmers or people who live in the country and work in the country, their language that they use daily is not only not poetic, it's prosaic, but often filled with quaint expressions and sometimes punctuated with vulgarity. And so he wants to take the ordinary language that is there, but not to replicate it, but to kind of use it as a base, a clay, and to reshape it so that he fixes its defects. So he wants to have his cake and eat it too. The problem is, how do you represent rustic rural life and still make it poetic? It's a kind of paradox that is going to be very hard to do. And so he wants to substitute a kind of poetic language. Let me drop down a little bit here. This is a very famous moment in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. For all good poetry, as opposed to bad poetry, is also the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. That is to say, excess. Remember Blake talking about the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, that you have to, in the first instance, experience nature without any constraints, without any restrictions brought on you by civilization. You have to get past the smell of manure, for example. You have to get past the fact that you're drinking from cups that are made of clay, not china, and that you're sometimes eating with your hands, and that the food is more basic and not cooked with sauces, and all of these sorts of primitive things, and that the poet has to immerse himself completely in that experience, more than usual. But then, afterwards, that experience has to be modified and directed by our thoughts. And so he wants to introduce the notion of experience first, without restriction, followed by a rational processing of that experience. One parallel way that I can explain it is that a lot of times musicians who are under great pressure to be creative and to produce new things get stuck into the ruts, the traditions, the habitual ways of performing music. And in order to innovate and to break outside of those guidelines and be creative and bring something new, they can't get there unless they use mind-altering drugs, heroin, cocaine, those sorts of things, to liberate their minds from the tyranny of habit. And so it's the tyranny of habit in poetry that Wordsworth is trying to escape from. All right. So he wants ordinary language, but he still wants to say that the language of prose can be well adapted to poetry. And this is kind of the key here, that you can take ordinary language as a base and somehow retain the integrity or authenticity of that language and elevate it to the level of poetry without losing the truthfulness of the ordinary and without sacrificing the elevated nature of poetry. It's a very difficult thing to do, but this is the theme, the argument in his preface, that it is possible to model poetry, elevated language, on ordinary things. So what we're going to do is, as usual, we're going to use a couple of tools. One of the first things I would do, I'm not doing it in this talk, but I would certainly go to the OED and take a look at words such as engagement, because you wouldn't know what I know about that word unless you looked it up in the OED. Same with gratify, and so on. So after you've done that, let's copy this piece. And we'll go to tag crowd, and I'm going to paste it into tag crowd. As usual, I'm going to say I want the minimum frequency to be 3. It can be anything you want. You don't have to do that. I want to see the frequency. I'm going to skip the Boolean exclusions right now because it'll filter them out anyway, and just click on visualize. And I want to make sure that I have actually interpreted the theme of this, the argument of his preface, accurately. And look at here. The most important thing is he's talking about language, and that's correct. How do you capture in poetic language the ordinary life of rustic laborers and rustic people? And he's talking about poems and prose and feelings and the differences between the two worlds. So tag crowd seems to affirm that my reading of the theme of this lyric, the preface to the lyrical ballads, is on track. Again, you can use whatever readability tool you want. I'm going to use the same one. And when I run it through, I'm not sure why this is not processing. It's really slow. While I'm waiting for that to come up, I want to show you what the results were. And this might look familiar. This is the chart that I used before, except now I've added Mr. Wordsworth in here. Let's just make him red. So let's take a look. We have a 1,689 word count, 640 unique words, 38% unique. Look at this. This is, to me, a really interesting paradox. A paradox meaning an inherent contradiction that seems very difficult to explain. His readability level is far more difficult than Johnson or Sidney. He's at a 14.5, which basically, if you remember that high school ends at grade 12, he's talking about 2.5 years. This reading difficulty is 2.5 years of university, basically the middle of second year university. When you compare that with Sidney, whose grade level of difficulty was grade 10, and Johnson, whose grade level was grade 8, Wordsworth is coming in at 14.5. He's got approximately the same longest sentence as Johnson. But look at this. The number of syllables per word is 1.6. He's using more sophisticated language than Johnson or Sidney. And yet he's talking about poetry being inspired by ordinary people, ordinary life, and ordinary language. Ordinary language, most, I think the statistic is something like most males have a vocabulary of something like 300 to 400 words. My dogs have a vocabulary of 200. The more educated you become and the more sophisticated your control over language becomes, the greater your vocabulary. But 38% of his words are unique. 1.6 average syllables per word is much more difficult than Johnson or Sidney. And look at the average words per sentence is 40. That's ridiculous. How can you be talking about ordinary life and have your sentences so long and sophisticated? But that is the entire point about the lyrical ballads, that he is imposing poetic standards onto an ordinary subject. And the result is this contradictory, paradoxical combination of content that looks for simplicity, but language that may seem simple, but in fact underneath is extraordinarily complex. Now, I want to add one other piece just to open up your minds to how you can start to think about analyzing passages. And I want to show you something that I've done here. When I began this course with you, one of the things I suggested was that you cannot read literature like a laundry list, that you really have to roll up your sleeves and take multiple passes and read the damn stuff over and over and over and give your mind a chance to absorb. So even with 3 degrees and 40 years of experience of reading literature, I still have to read stuff 2 and 3 and 4 times before it sinks in. It's not that I'm stupid. It's the problem is that the language in the literature is so sophisticated and so nuanced that you owe it the discipline of time on task to immerse yourself. So here's what I did. You may think I don't have a life, which maybe I don't, but I printed out this part of the lyrical ballads, and what I did was I actually counted the number of sentences that were hypotactic and the number of sentences that were paratactic, and you can see that in the passage they come out almost even, 11 hypotactic sentences and 10 paratactic sentences. I also marked in green the number of sentences that were right branching and the number that were left branching. And you can see that almost all of his sentences are right branching. So he doesn't have the left branching frequency that Sidney has. And you can see that when I was talking about the theme of this passage, the argument, that there's an inherent contradiction between simplicity and complexity, because he wants poetry to describe ordinary life. Here in the stylistics of the passage, we see the same interesting paradox. He's got a lot of hypotactic sentences with subordination. What is subordination? Well, it's got to do with which, if, since, then, because, all of those words that create subordination. And parataxis is about even. So this balance between hypotactic and paratactic, to me, echoes the balance between the ordinary, which is the subject of his study, and the artificially created figurative language of poetry, which is the medium in which he wants to express himself. So yes, I printed this out and I basically used this printout to do only that. So these are the kinds of things you need to keep in mind. And what I would do here is I would then take the total number of sentences in the Wordsworth passage, and if 10 of them are hypotactic, I would calculate that as a percentage, and 11 and 10 were paratactic, I would count that as a percentage. They are basically 100% right branching. I have not done the hypotactic and paratactic calculations, but there's another parameter that you can now add to your understanding of the passage. And as you prepare for test 1, the more you prepare yourself with these kinds of explorations of the text, the better off you're going to be in being able to answer the questions solidly and respectably.